But there's just a couple more points that I'd love to get your take on. Chapter 4 is really important insofar as it's about the Jewish people and the Torah, and Jesus's and the rest of Paul's understanding of the Torah and their relationship to it. Often, so you start the chapter with the subtitle "Supplementing, Not Canceling the Torah." Yeah. Oftentimes, and this is a good move, but people will pro-Torah Christians or pro-Torah Messianic Jews, because there's different views of the Torah even within Messianic Judaism.
Exactly.
But they'll go to Matthew chapter 5, that Jesus doesn't come to abolish but to fulfill. And if even one little jot or dot falls off of this, right, heaven and earth won't pass away, or heaven and earth pass away before that happens. But what's interesting is you think in terms of Luke as this Gentilized writer who actually really doesn't have the same Torah-centric view as Matthew. But that's actually not true, because there's a Lucan parallel to the Matthean material in Matthew 5, and you highlight that, right? It comes up in Luke 16, I think it is.
That's right.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about Jesus's kind of program of supplementing rather than canceling, and what you mean by that.
Yes. Well, what scholars often point to is the way in which Jesus' interpretations sometimes go beyond the Torah. And the one classic illustration of this is in something like his teaching about divorce, and where there's a greater level of stringency, where it's in some ways the opposite of what the images people have often had of Jesus does away with the Torah and free. Where one, if one looks at where Yeshua offers something that's a little different than what the straightforward reading of the Torah is, it's often where he's actually being stricter and more stringent, or
no question,
more demanding.
In rabbinic terms, that's building a fence right around the Torah.
Exactly. And that's a lot of what we see in the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew chapter 5. And so what I think is being recognized here is this sense that yes, there's a way in which Jesus comes and goes beyond what's simply there, but that this is a kind of addition. This is like as I said, a supplementing of what's in the Torah in a way that realizes the purposes of the Torah, as opposed to something that involves some kind of subtraction or nullification. And so another illustration of this is the way in which Jesus views his call to discipleship as a realization of the Torah, where he's speaking to the rich young man, and so he says, have you observed the commandments, in effect? And the rich young man lists off at least the commandments of the second table of the Torah and says yes. And Yeshua says, well, that's good. If you want to be perfect, if you want to be complete, in effect, if you want to be complete in the observance of the Torah, sell everything that you have and come follow me. And again, this is one where often this is then understood, I think rightly so, as Yeshua is now pointing him to the first table of the Torah and saying the way for you in your life fully understand and observe what it means to worship God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. This is what it means. And in this sense, the call to discipleship is something that clearly goes beyond the Torah. I mean, there's no commandments in the Torah that say sell all that you have, and go follow this rabbi, but what Jesus is teaching is that the way the road to complete realization of the purposes of the Torah is to be his disciple. And so this is a kind of supplementing of what Torah is demanding, but there's no implication in this that as a result of being his disciple, you're now going to be discontinuing your observance of the other mitzvot, the other commandments.
Right, that's right.
In fact, it's the other way around. It's being his disciple and learning from him is what then enables you to realize and to be a full observer of the Torah as a whole.
Yeah, beautiful. Absolutely. And the going beyond, if you want, or the supplementation has no bearing on leaving it behind, the rest of it behind, as you know. You know, what's interesting, you talked about the rich man selling his things and following Jesus. You know, in the I'm not going to describe this for your benefit, Mark, but for the benefit of our viewers. In the time of Jesus, there's a text or certain texts that are Aramaic translations of the Hebrew Bible. They're called targums, and these texts were being built around the time of Jesus and then several centuries after Jesus in what Dr. Kinzer talks about as rabbinic Judaism. And in the Aramaic translations of "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your might," because in Hebrew might is me'od. Really, technically, it just means "you're very," right? Later Jewish translators were puzzled by this, and in certain manuscripts of the Targums of the Aramaic, they have that for that last word me'od, very, they have mammon, your money, your wealth, right? With coal, right? All of your money, right? So Jesus is actually tying us into what probably would have been a well-known theology in his time. Oh, you want to be perfect? Let's go back to the Shema. Let's go back to the Vahavta prayer, and say, okay, now let's really do it. Sell all your things, right? So,
yes.
Yeah. So he's well within a Jewish strand, even in his taking another step, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Very good. Wonderful. Okay. So again, I could talk to you about Torah all day long as well. Let's do chapter 5. I'll ask you one question on chapter 5 and another question on chapter 6. Chapter 6, I just thought was, I mean, let's just say I kept nodding my head the whole time, right? So chapter 5, you talk about God's divine boule, or God's divine plan, if you will, right, in Greek. And you discuss the fact that this plan doesn't just mean a plan for the ecclesia. Rather, it's a plan for both the ecclesia, that is Jews and Gentiles who believe in Jesus, and for the Jewish people as a whole, right? Even those outside the ecclesia. And you make a really good point for this. You trace the history of rabbinic Judaism, and you rightly note God's continued plan. You talk about certain Jewish texts. You talk about the Mishnah and the Talmud. So anybody interested in rabbinics, chapter 5 is great for them. Here's what you say towards the end of it. This is page 238. In its mature Talmudic form, this tradition, that is the rabbinic tradition, derives its power from the hope of a messianic future, a hope that is animated and sustained by the veiled Messiah, whose resurrection provides the irrevocable pledge that he will one day restore the kingdom to Israel. Okay, so A, if you could unpack what you mean by that a little bit, and then 2, well, I'll let you unpack and then just ask a follow-up question.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, this statement, well, I think it's dependent on a lot of points made earlier in the chapter, and some of the exegesis made in earlier chapters as well. It might be worth my just saying something about that.
Absolutely.
One of the arguments I make is that in particularly Acts of the Apostles, the Pharisees are treated in a different way than we see them treated elsewhere in the New Testament, and that they're treated in a much more positive and favorable light. And I particularly highlight the text that speaks about Gamaliel, and where he argues in the Sanhedrin against simply persecuting and executing the apostles and trying to snuff out this new movement. And he makes that argument based on a certain understanding of history, and that if God is with these people, you're not going to be able to stop them. and what I'm arguing here is that that view of history that he expresses is both a Pharisaic view and the view that becomes one, you might say, of this Messianic movement that the apostles share. But it's actually not the view that the Sadducees held, and that of course, everybody recognizes that the author of Acts is trying to make this point that yes, Gamaliel was right, and we see that the Sanhedrin is dissolved and the Sadducees cease to function in any way as a leadership group, and yet the apostles survive and the Messianic community prospers and thrives, and this is a sign of God's providential care, which is all true. But what people often don't recognize is that just as the apostles and their successors thrive, so do the Pharisees. And that the Pharisees and their and particularly Gamaliel's heirs, in literally here now, even it's his descendants that become the patriarchs of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, and really the key figures in the founding of rabbinic Judaism. And so my argument is that Luke himself is looking forward to this second century reality, anticipating second century reality, and recognizing that God in his mysterious purposes is himself at work in the reconstitution of Jewish life under the heirs of Gamaliel. And now, what I'm also trying to point out in that chapter, of course, is something that's not so positive, and that is that there are aspects of this prophetic evangelion, this prophetic good news that have to do with the Jewish people and the land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem and the Torah, which get lost in the life of the Jewish people. Excuse me, in the life of the church and in the message. And that, but those elements of the good news live on in the life of the Jewish people in this tradition that is presided over by the descendants of Gamaliel. So I talk there about a fractured people of God, but also a fractured gospel. And this becomes significant because a lot of times people think, well, the church has the gospel and Jesus, and the Jewish people still have the promises of God, but they're kind of like the Old Testament promises. And so it's as if the Jewish people have the Old Testament and the church has the New Testament. And what I'm trying to show is it's not that simple. It's in fact, there's something fundamental about the death and the resurrection of Jesus that lives on in its substance, only in the tradition of the Jewish people, and not and therefore in the rabbinic tradition, and not in the life of the church. So my conclusion, as I tie this also together with these other texts in Luke and Acts that are speaking of the proleptic nature of the death and the resurrection of Jesus, my argument is that if there's a fracture of the good news, then the one who is the object, or the subject of the good news, the resurrected Jesus, must also be present in the midst of this ongoing tradition of Jewish life, just as he is present within the life of the church.
No, I mean, I think, you do a lot of careful theology and a lot of careful textual work in that chapter. I mean, I think that on a general level, though, on the basis of your very well argued point that of the proleptic nature of this, I mean, if Luke and the editor of Luke Acts envisions that Jesus will come back to a Jewish Jerusalem, right, at an actual tupos, right, it has to be that God in some way has God's blessing and presence with the Jewish people, even those who don't believe in Jesus. It's so funny. Like often, you'll get, and even I was I kind of like stopped for a second as I read what you were saying, because and when I teach in churches, I'm a broken record. God's promises to Israel are still here. God still works with God's people. But then if I were to ask the audience if they thought, yeah, but is God really working in rabbinic Judaism or modern Judaism or Orthodox or Hasidic Judaism? Or is God, I wonder what their answer would be. And I had to stop and think for a second, But I do think, from a Tanakhic perspective, from a promises of God never fail perspective, of course, I agree with what you're writing, but it's just, I think that's a big bite. It would be a big bite for some people in the church.
Oh, yes. Yes. And this is, and I understand that. This is, in some ways, you can only get to my conclusions in that chapter by working your way carefully and
Correct.
kind of working through an internal process of the other chapters.
Right.
And once you've processed those things, I think then this conclusion can begin to make sense.
Right.
But it's not like self-evident, independent of having gone through a lot of that exegetical work beforehand.